You must understand, the touch of your hand makes my pulse react. That it's only the thrill of boy meeting girl opposites attract. It's physical, only logical. You must try to ignore that it means more than that. Oh, what's love got to do with it? What's love but a second-hand emotion? What's love got to do with it? Who needs a heart when a heart can be broken? It may seem to you that I'm acting confused when you're close to me.
Good evening and welcome to another installment of Mental Health Mondays, brought to you by Saving Grace Community Church and Grace House, Cincinnati, a nonprofit in ministry of Saving Grace Community Church. Tonight, joining with on this day, this beautiful Monday afternoon, our resident expert, Dr. Quentin Moss, President, CEO, Founder, and Chief Medical Officer of Modern Psychiatry. Good evening.
Hey, good evening, brother. Good to be here.
And also, we are excited tonight to have with us Maria Cole of Woman Helping Women. Good evening.
Good evening. Happy to be here.
Tonight, we are tackling a very serious subject. Our topic is Get Your Hands Off of Me, a view of domestic violence. At the front of our show, we played a clip of Tina Turner, who, in her relationship with Ike Turner, perhaps are the most notable folks that whose relationship relates to or example of a relationship that's volatile and really speaks to, by definition, domestic violence. We know that in America that nearly every 20 minutes reported there are cases of domestic violence, 1 in 4 of women and 1 in 9 of men. We know that. But despite those facts, despite those stories, things still seem to be prevalent and exist. In fact, during the pandemic, some outlets have reported that domestic violence, we've seen increases in it to 8, 9, 10, even more percentage in terms of that. And so one of the things that if I were at home and I had the both of you, I was looking at both of you. One of the questions I would want to know is what goes on in the brain of a person, Dr. Moss, who believes that they have a right to put their hands on someone if they don't disagree, or they don't agree with them.
You know, that's a tough question to answer, because I think that it's manifold. You know, there are some people who feel that they have the right to just, dominate other people, who lack empathy and the ability to engage. But there are others who struggle with communication, and they find through modeling or seeing other behaviors that that's the way that you communicate and engage with someone. And then there are people, unfortunately, who have suffered violence themselves, and being the sufferer of violence, they might be at an increased risk to also perpetuate violence to other people when we think about domestic violence. You can go on to talk about people who have problems with impulse control. There is a possibility that, substance abuse also plays a part in when people perpetuate domestic violence. So there are a number of different combinations and reasons why this happens, not just one sole thing, but it's rather complex. And oftentimes the person who is the perpetrator is often someone who's also in need of care and treatment, much like the person who's being affected upon.
So it's when we think about domestic violence, Maria, we do think about those involving with intimate partners. But it help us expand the definitions for us tonight and help us to understand that question that many people have is, if it's so bad, why won't they leave and why are they still there?
Yeah, I think our survivors at Women Helping Women struggle with that question every single day. And honestly, what we hear most is that love has a lot to do with it. So people stay in domestically abusive relationships for any number of reasons. A lot of times it has to do with kind of the logistics. So if someone has been with a person for 1, 2, 10, 20 years, they might share finances with that person. They might share a family with that person. Even if they don't share children, they might share fur babies, so they're pets with that person. And their lives are intertwined in a lot of different ways. So it's really hard to extract that abuse from everything else that's in that situation. And we hear from a lot of survivors that they do stay in those abusive situations because they do share kids. And maybe the person who is the abuser is abusive toward that survivor, but they're not abusive toward the kids. Maybe they're a really good parent. And so they don't want to take that really good parent away from their kids and have their kids miss out on that extra parental unit just because they're experiencing abuse. A lot of times we also see that intimate partner violence isn't just about physical abuse. It could be about that emotional manipulation. It could be about the financial abuse. And if somebody's controlling the entire family's finances and they've never allowed that survivor to have access to a credit card in their own name, or they've damaged their credit so much so that they can't go and be a financially independent individual, they're completely reliant on that abusive person. And they don't feel like they have the power or the control in that relationship to then leave and try to start anew. So, and ultimately, like I said at the beginning, if you've been with someone for 10 years, the likelihood that there's an underpinning of love is inevitable. So it's really, really hard to disassociate the love from the cycle of abuse, which ultimately often involves what we call honeymoon period after the abuse happens. So the likelihood that the abuse escalates, an abusive incident happens, whether that's emotional abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, but then after that abuse happens, the perpetrator or the aggressor is going to then say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do this to you, I'll never do it again. They try to make amends, they try to potentially give the survivor gifts or allow them a little bit more of, a little bit more control. And then that abuse cycle happens again and again and again, which then just kind of elongates the relationship and ultimately leads to survivors not leaving very often.
Do you feel at times that, again, because they're so used to that, though they recognize it not being a healthy situation, do you think that they somehow get kind of, inoculated to it, that it's just, this is what my life is?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why we try so hard in any sort of support group that we run at the agency or any sort of community education that we do, to always emphasize the fact that everyone deserves a healthy relationship, regardless of their background, of how they grew up, of their current situation. Everyone needs and deserves a healthy relationship. And then we lay out all of the qualities of a healthy relationship, which ultimately always comes down or back to equality. And so when we start to describe a healthy relationship, a lot of folks are like, oh, that's not what I'm currently living in, or that's not what I'm currently experiencing. And they would have no idea had we or someone else not told them or kind of enlightened them to the fact that maybe their current relationship isn't the most healthy. Maybe it's just unhealthy, or maybe ultimately it is abusive. So it's important for us as community members, if we're seeing people in our lives experience unhealthiness or abusive behavior in their relationship, to have a conversation, to really bring it to their attention, not in a mean way, just in a way that is, hey, I'm really concerned, or I've noticed a couple of qualities that just like aren't sitting right with me. Can we have a conversation, or can you tell me a little bit about what you're experiencing? And then ultimately, hopefully, that person who's in that situation is going to have, I guess, just a wider lens or perspective into their own situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Moss mentioned earlier that many of the perpetrators, perhaps those who are committing these crimes, there may be some addiction or some other things going on with them. In terms of what you see as a person in your end, those victims, do you find that because of love that they may be also partaking in illicit activity?
So what we see is that oftentimes the cause of the abuse or the cause of the harm that somebody is experiencing is not directly due to any sort of substance use or abuse. What we do see is that the abuse makes any sort of substance use and abuse worse, because that's their coping mechanism. So we always say that the cause of the abuse is the perpetrator or the aggressor, which ultimately leads back to power and control. Every abusive situation is always about power and control. But we do see that survivors use substances, whether that's alcohol or other drugs, to cope with the fact that they are experiencing abuse, whether that's physical or emotional, on a day-to-day basis, which then leads into other societal issues. And so at Women Helping Women, what we do is, if we're noticing that one of our survivors is using or misusing any sort of alcohol or other substances, we'll refer them to community partners of ours, because we want them to be their best selves. And if they're using or misusing substances, they might not be their best selves, and they might not be able to care for their family in the best way possible. So ultimately, we want them to be healthy across the spectrum, not just have a healthy relationship, but really have a healthy body and a healthy life.
So Dr. Moss, hearing that in terms of a person who may enter into be in Maria's office or be a Women Helping Women, how do you, in terms of engage and support them and boost them up so they can realize that the normal that they have is really not normal, just to empower them to improve their self-worth? How would you engage them in a session?
I think one of the things we try to do first is try to create a safe environment.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that comes with the atmosphere that we try to create in the office, how we engage in the tone and the proxemics of the room and all of that. But it also is going to be specific for each client. So some clients, because of their experience, may find that they want a particular gender or they want a particular race. Trying to reduce all that we can that may create triggers for the client and make disclosure, safer for them. So that's part of what we would try to do. Then, with all of our assessments, we're trying to figure out, with the trauma they've experienced, have they, started to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, whether acutely or chronically over time. Have they developed mood disorders as a result of these evidence of trauma? We know that trauma changes mood and anxiety, but it also changes the brain and how the body perceives pain, how it interacts with cardiovascular disease, diabetes. Trauma affects all of those things, which may lead to poor outcomes for some clients.
So, Maria, when someone comes into your office, typically, what do they look like?
So we serve all survivors of all types of gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence. Most often we're seeing female-identified folks, and ultimately we're serving a lot of female-identified people of color. So just by the nature of where we're located, our main office is down on 9th Street, down in downtown Cincinnati, but we also have an office in downtown Hamilton and one advocate who serves Brown and Adams counties. But just because of the nature of our services, we do see a lot of Black women come into our office. But ultimately, we're going to serve any survivor who comes in. So whether that's a male-identified survivor, whether that's someone of another gender identity, we serve people of all racial identities, all ethnicities, which is something that we constantly have to talk about in the community because our name is really misleading. I mean, we say, oh, we're women helping women. But ultimately, in every program that I do, I have to then make a caveat, because we really will serve anyone who comes to us and self-identifies as a survivor of gender-based violence. So we're never putting that, I guess, that label on anyone. And also, we work with a slightly different definition of what domestic violence looks like than the criminal justice system or any sort of courts. Because if a survivor comes to us and says, I've experienced emotional abuse twice, we're going to believe them, and we empower them to make their own choices, whether that's going through any sort of system, whether that's the criminal justice system or any sort of other court system, or whether that's just seeking some therapy or other support services. So we're never labeling someone a survivor. They're taking up that label themselves.
I imagine that what you hear about the perpetrator may be startling at times. And I'm sure that, people that help people, when you hear people who've been victim of anything, your heart goes out to them, and then you say to yourself, oh, you're such a nice person. You ask yourself, man, how does such a nice person like yourself find yourself in the situation that you're in? And to that, I ask you, how do so many nice people find themselves in those situations?
So intimate partner violence is much more prevalent, I think, than most folks come to understand. And the fact of the matter is that I think every single person knows someone who has experienced intimate partner violence, whether that's teen dating violence, so intimate partner violence that happened when they were a teenager, typically between the ages of 11 to 18, or full-blown intimate partner violence for those who are young adults or adults. And honestly, people who experience intimate partner violence come from all different types of backgrounds. I think we hear about kind of that like stereotypical victim of intimate partner violence, but the vast majority of folks who are experiencing intimate partner violence might not look like that stereotypical victim. And you can be the nicest person in the world and find yourself in a situation where you are over your head, or where you thought that the person that you were dating or married to was the nicest person in the world, and ultimately it turned out that they weren't. And most of the time, what we hear from our survivors is that the perpetrators don't start off as abusive. They're not going to show their abusive tendencies most often right off the bat. It's going to take a month, multiple months, sometimes even years, for them to ultimately gain the power and control that they need to truly control the victim or the survivor. And most of the time, us as bystanders or family, friends of those folks who are in that abusive situation are not going to be able to pick up on their abusive tendencies, because the abuser is a master controller, is a master manipulator. And when that couple is around other people, that abuser isn't typically, most often, going to be abusive in front of other people. They're going to be the nicest person in the world. They're going to manipulate the situation. They're going to make everyone like them and think that they're the best partner that this person has ever seen, experienced. And then that abuse is going to come after that event, or when they're at home with one another at the end of the night.
Dr. Moss, put a label on someone who is a master manipulator and controller. What disorder would you, in your DSM-5, what would you identify them as being?
I'm not sure if I can put a DSM-5 on it, because I think that people demonstrate certain traits and behaviors, that kind of ebb and flow. So there are people who may not have a diagnosable, condition, who may also be the manipulator or the perpetrator. So I think it's difficult to put a grand label across all of that, though we know that many of those people may suffer from various types of conditions or their own exposures.
Well, one of the most highly, as we began our show, recognized abuser perpetrator is, and reportedly and allegedly, Ike Turner. And it's interesting to hear his perspective, because while we've been able to shed a little light on the victim, the perpetrator come and understand that mindset. And maybe he was unique or not, but let's take a look at a clip from an interview that he had a couple years ago.
Reporter Mary Major Jack gets Ike to open up and talk about the alleged beatings he gave his former wife, Tina. In today's Star Profile segment, we get a closer look at Ike Turner.
Oh, so you done lost your...
No, leave her alone, Ike.
Ike, I want to read something from the May issue of Vanity Fair. It says, quote, Ike Turner struck Tina on a regular basis for 16 years. With everything from shoes to coat hangers, once putting a burning cigarette to her lips.
Okay, I can stop you. I know where you're going. Okay, with all of this, if you look at Tina, you see any of those scars? She said I broke her jawbone. If you ask a doctor can tell you, if I broke her jaw, no way is she going on stage.
You admit that you have slapped Tina before, but why, Ike?
She would be walking around looking sad, with a lip drop, and I keep asking her, and what is the matter with you? What's wrong? And it's always, nothing. And it would go on for a day or two till finally, why the don't you? And then this is where I would slap her or something. Then she would change her mood or attitude or something. Let me tell you, that I would say this. I would do no more to Tina, and I did no more to Tina than I would want somebody to do to my mother.
Tina has said that after a while, making love to you was like rape.
That's another lie. Boy, that chick, I swear, boy, they ain't missing no hole. Look, there are very few Ikettes that I had that I didn't go with. If it's anything, man, I never even had time. I wanted to make love at home. I mean, unless it was through guilt that I don't.
Do you ever regret anything that happened between you and Tina?
No, but I don't see why I should be put down on. Whatever I did for 18 years that we were together, man, it fed us, it slept us, it raised our kids, it put them through school, it did whatever we did. And so I don't know how all of this could have been bad, man.
Yeah. So to hear that interview shows that, particularly as he was labeled a perpetrator, there's definitely a disconnect. And so if he comes into your office, Dr. Moss, what's the first question? Will you say, how can I help you? What will you say?
We have our own, inner prejudices about, how I would want to judge his behavior and all that he's did. And, clearly everything that he did was wrong. There's no doubt about that. But that probably would be my first question, is how can I help you? And even if the chief complaint of why he's coming in doesn't match what we may know about his issues with domestic violence, if I can gain some trust and build some type of therapeutic relationship, then eventually we can hit that target. But that would be my question is, now how can I help you such that eventually we can get to the place where he doesn't perpetrate anymore, that he and others can be safe again. That would be the ultimate goal. But his presentation showed a great deal of course, denial, rationalization, minimalization, which occurs a great deal in people who perpetrate this type of violence.
If someone relates to you, Maria, and they paint the picture of that being the perpetrator, how do you guide them in a discussion that will lead to them being empowered to be free and safe?
That's a good question. So it's our job as advocates not to tell someone what to do, but to present choices for them. And then they're going to make ultimately the decision for themselves, whether they want to leave that relationship or stay in that relationship. I would say that we would approach the situation like many others. And if a survivor were to report this, we would probably, if there is imminent danger to their safety, we would probably say something about that. So we would say something like, I'm really concerned for your safety at home. Do you have someone that maybe you could go stay with for a few days? Because what he was saying did seem like someone might be in imminent danger in his presence, because there was certainly physical violence that was occurring. And then we would present a slew of other options. And that survivor has the option to stay in that relationship, to remain in that house with that person, to go find a support system in a family member or a friend, a cousin, that they could stay with for a little bit. They could pursue a protection order against that person, which is also known as a restraining order. And we can help folks fill out that paperwork and go through that process with them. They might want to seek therapeutic services, and we're happy to connect them with a therapist who's skilled with folks who have been through intimate partner violence in the past. So there's a myriad of options for someone. The most important thing to tell someone in this situation is that we believe them and we support whatever decision they make, because for the most part in these situations, all of their power has been taken away, regardless of the decision. I mean, you heard him reference the fact that her emotional state wasn't what he wanted it to be, and he was controlling that emotional state. So every decision pretty much that a survivor is making in these abusive situations is being controlled and manipulated. So we really want to give that power back to them and hopefully give them a way out ultimately. Whether they take that way out right now or in a few years is really left up to them.
Can this type of behavior, Dr. Moss, be generational? And Maria, do you see cases where victim-wise, folks in the family were victims of domestic violence? And do you see, Dr. Moss, and believe to what level, I wonder, where in a family where there's been generational perpetrators of domestic violence? Maria?
Yeah, so we do see on occasion that there is a generational component, and most of that goes back to the fact that that younger generation might not have seen models of a healthy relationship. And so that's really where our prevention and education team comes in. And that's why we're doing all sorts of healthy relationship education in the local schools, because even if they're not seeing their parents or guardians or another generation model healthy relationship behaviors, we want them to know that a healthy relationship is possible. So ultimately, we're hoping that we can break that generational cycle by giving them the language to identify violence in a relationship and the language to identify healthy relationships for themselves and for other people.
So I've grown up in a home where this was the norm. And now I say that I saw my dad or hit my mom, or I saw my mom hit my dad. And that's just the way it is. Dr. Moss, what do you say?
I would agree with her that, having children to witness this as the behavior, how people interact, that becomes the model of how we then build relationships later. But the type of work that they're doing is very important, because we want to create some type of dissonance. We want some type of discord in our observations, knowing that we see this, but we've been told that this is wrong and that this is better. And that can start the process of breaking the cycle of doing what we witnessed, instead of, and moving forward with something that's a bit healthier. But our goal is to provide comfort and safety for the person who's suffering from domestic violence. That's very important. And I believe that people are redeemable. And our goal is also to help that person who is the perpetrator. And even in the midst of this Facebook show, we're going to have quite a few folks who are sufferers. And maybe there'll be people who have done this who start scratching their head and thinking about, maybe I want to try to do this a different way. And we want to also offer to them that there's an opportunity to break that cycle, depending on others, to be able to have some support and treatment if necessary, to do that.
Thank you both tonight. This has been awesome discussion. We're dealing with some technical issues on our end, but this will replay, especially on YouTube. But I just want to say, Maria, thank you for your time and your insight. And would you give again the number of women helping women, and how they may contact you or someone to help them?
Yeah, so we have a 24-hour hotline. Folks can call, text, or chat our hotline, and our hotline number is 513-381-5610, and that is 24 hours. So if someone is experiencing violence at 3 a.m., they can call us, or 3 p.m., they can call us. An advocate, a real-life person, is going to answer that hotline number, and anyone and everyone is welcome to call.
Thank you very much. To our viewers, we want to thank you for being with us tonight. We understand we experienced some technical difficulty, but you may be able to watch and view this show. We'll give you notice on YouTube channel. But thank you for you, Dr. Moss, as always, giving your expertise and providing us with insight to help us understand cognitively and from a physiological standpoint what goes on when things don't go right in terms of our behavior. To our viewers, we want to encourage you till next time to feel better, become better, and live better. Good night, everyone.